is a pleasure. It is a pleasure for me to be here, and it's an honor to moderate this panel with such outstanding colleagues. Thank you for being here. I would like to thank CAFA, SAR, NYU, and PEN America for inviting me and for organizing this symposium and this panel. Of course, especially thank you, Caroline, Camila, Jesse, and Jeremy. Thank you for all. The title of this panel, as you know, of course, is the significance of university autonomy. And we have three panelists who I will introduce shortly, and who will share their perspective on this important topic. Universities are foundational for functioning real democracies, as crucial as civil society, a free press, or an independent judiciary. Yet, if they are not able to function in an autonomous way without external political interference, universities cannot serve this purpose. In the past decade, outside actors have dramatically violated university autonomy, but by taking over core institutional function, including governance and management, pedagogy, and personal decision, financing, and inviolability of campus spaces, including surveillance and militarization, policing campus, as well as criminalization of students and faculty. Indeed, university autonomy is one of the most important dimensions of academic freedom. In other words, the attacks on education as a public good are attacks on university autonomy and academic freedom. University autonomy includes the connection with the resistance and overcoming of neoliberal university, with budget cuts and concomitant pressure to response to narrow metrics or of productivist evaluation, with the consequent precarization of teaching and research. For us, the way to counteract this is to strengthen the academic and scientific communities and their relationship with the civil society organization. Currently, in several countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and in some regions of the world, there are attacks against public university, harassment of academic and scientists, especially in social sciences, humanities, and arts, for their research or teaching topics and agendas. Denial of climate change and gender inequalities, It's okay. Welcome, Basuki. Okay. We have 4 panelists again. I am currently in several countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, and some regions of the world. There are attacks against public university, harassment of academics and scientists, especially in social sciences, humanities, and art, for their research or teaching topics and agendas. Denial of climate change and gender inequalities, budget cuts, which in some cases, such as Argentina, reduce 70%, not the 17, my English is bad, but not 17, 70 of the funds allocated to public education and the Argentina scientific system, and persecution of students and teacher unions that protest against these policies. Some of these dimensions will be addressed by our panelists. Now, I want to introduce the panelists. I will introduce them all together, and then I give them the floor. In first place, Daniel Friedrich, teacher colleagues at Columbia. In the second place, Natasha Leonard, Associate Director of Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism Program, the new school. In the third place, Atina Mutua, University of Buffalo, professor in law, University of Law of Buffalo Critical Legal Collective Coordinating Committee. And our last panelist will be Vasuki Nesia, Professor of Practice, Human Rights and International Law, Gallatin, NYU. Each of you have between 18 and 20 minutes for your presentation. No?
Yeah, 8 and 10.
Ah, perfect. No, it's so much better because we have in the beginning we have 5 panelists. So after 3 panelists, no 4 panelists. So the time changes. Yeah, changes. It's better for all of us. Yeah, between 8 and 10 minutes for your presentation. Then we will open up the question and answer session and the dialogue with all of you, of course. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, thanks to Caroline for inviting me. And I think a landmark of a really good, well-organized event is when we haven't heard, before this, I hadn't heard any of the other panelists talk. And my notes speak to what has happened before, right? You'll see echoes of what has happened before when I talk about what's going on right now at Teachers College. I also have to say that I do not represent Teachers College by only my own views. And I say that because that is one of the new policies I'm going to discuss now, that I have to say that in order to protect my institution from me. I also have to say that there's a distinction between Teachers College and Columbia University. We're affiliated, but we're not the same. We have different regulations, different board, different admin, etc. But what happens at Columbia deeply impacts what happens at Teachers College. An example is that several of our students were arrested last year in the events at Columbia, but Teachers College decided not to pursue any disciplinary action against them as opposed to Columbia, in part, but not only because of faculty and student activism to get there. But I have to say, not everything is bright. Last year, there were attempts to discipline at least 2 faculty, to my knowledge. Since this process were not made public, I'm not going to go into details, but these were tenured folks who were investigated by, on one case, things that took place in their classroom would have been complete normal in other years. And in the second case, a message on their signature line signaling support for faculty boycotting Columbia's invitation to NYPD. Both cases were then dropped by admin. I'm mentioning this because it sets up something that I'm going to say later. This year, after a relatively quiet summer and Shafiq's resignation at Columbia, there was an opening, I thought, for a new beginning, for reestablishing trust relationships. But admin chose to welcome us with 11 new or revised policies crafted by a committee composed mostly of administrators and a few select faculty appointed by those administrators. bypassing all faculty governance structures. I'm going to give you some examples of those policies. Protesters need to ask for permission to protest at least 5 days in advance of said protest. We all know that all historically significant protests ask for permission. All right? There's a tabling policy that starts by being framed as an issue of accessibility, of not blocking egress, not blocking hallways, totally reasonable, and immediately pivots to the content of what can and cannot be tabled. And anything seen as threatening cannot be part of the threat of the tables. There's a new policy on use of social media that again starts with official use of social media, fine, TC's own bodies and what can be posted or not. But then it mentions that faculty's individual own social media accounts could be associated to our institution, so therefore we should be very careful what we post. As one of my colleagues put it brilliantly, I thought, in one of the meetings, these policies are about protecting the institution from faculty freedom instead of protecting our freedom to the kind of work we need to do. I also would say that these policies miss our main role as educators, replacing it with a role of police. The idea is that we should be afraid of controversy and not see it as a fundamental part of the educational process. Farida, I don't know if, Farida, she talked about her next project being about issues of safety, right? I think one thing I want us all to think about is how what's happening now, in many ways, is a conflating of discomfort, which for me is an essential aspect of a good education, with threats to safety. It's not the same to be uncomfortable with something than to feel threatened, just your safety threatened. And that conflation is a strategic, essential element of these policies of fear. So I want to make then 2 points, because I really want it to be brief. I really want a conversation and Q&A, so I want to make this very brief. I want to make 2 points here. One is that the implementation of these new policies is not really the point. Many of my colleagues, I think, are lost in how are you going to implement a policy about social media. That's not the point. The point is for them to be in place. The point is that faculty know they exist, even if they're never implemented, thus having a huge chilling effect, right? They can be also used for justification in decisions later and to protect the institution from Congress and from media. That's been stated explicitly in our meetings. The faculty, the institution is terrified of Congress now. For me, this is tied to what I think is a surrender. It's a surrender to external pressures, a surrender to demands of a Congress that has been overtaken by conservative efforts, by media, and the surrender has to do with taking them as the new reality, as a given, instead of fighting, all right? This is, and I think Pablo can speak much more to this, and also Camila mentioned this before, it is a huge contrast to what's happening right now, for example, in Argentina, where what Pablo mentioned about the budget cuts to universities and public education in general led to a protest with over 1 million people on the streets 2 weeks ago. And this is the largest challenge that the neo-fascist government in Argentina is facing from students, from the universities that also are supported by the population, right? Instead, what I fear is that universities here, most, not all, have just said, okay, this is the new reality, and so being called to Congress would cost us millions of dollars in legal fees, and we want to avoid that. So what we do is we just craft all these policies to respond to their demands of protecting our institution from faculty. This is also an area where administration is asking us to trust their discretion. These policies are very vague on purpose, but there's no accountability process to prevent the discretion from turning into profiling, which we are starting to see. The second main point I want to make besides that point about implementation not being the point, is that these new policies are inseparable from austerity measures. There has been budget cuts all over, and lecturers and other more vulnerable employees will feel the harshest impact of those policies. The financial model at institutions like Teachers College is unsustainable. We know that. We've known that for a long time. And these new policies are just one aspect of the ways in which budgetary concerns can be addressed, making it easier to fire people or to not renew their contracts. This is for me, one of the points of this event is to connect those dots, like Carol-Ann mentioned, right? So it's not just a policy issue. It's not just a freedom of expression issue. It's also an issue around privatization and about budget cuts and about austerity measures that have governed our institutions for a long time and are coming to fruition. There's a silver lining here, which is in the case of Teachers College, even though the faculty is divided, it is also organizing. Policies are now being reviewed by a more balanced committee after faculty really rejected the way in which these policies came to fruition. Even people that supported some of those policies said, this is not the way to do policy, right? And admin is feeling the heat in Teachers College. They are walking back some of those policies. They are trying to figure out ways to make them work. Sadly, in my view, students seem much more quiet this term. They're scared, and some of them have been harassed by admin. We have tons of examples of that. Some of them we can talk about, some of them we can't. I'm happy to discuss that. We were asked also by organizers of this event to think about strategies, to think about action. One thing I have is more of a question about what is open and what is closed when we separate the fight and the struggle for academic freedom from the specific issues or the topics that those freedoms are used around, right? As myself an anti-Zionist Jew, I am deeply critical of the state of Israel in many ways. But when I'm fighting for academic freedom, I want people that are concerned about other issues but are not with me on that one to fight with me here, right? And so, but I know that has a cost too. So I'm not proposing that, I'm just asking the question of what is gained and what is lost when we separate those things, right? Also, I think we really need to reflect on our own responsibility in supporting bans of offensive speech in the past. So in the past, many people have been supportive of not allowing things that they saw that made them uncomfortable on campus, on progressive sides. And I think that gave cannon fodder for a lot of these attacks on current issues, right? And again, we all have to think about those boundaries between what makes us uncomfortable or what disagrees with our principles versus what makes us unsafe. Not the same. So I'm going to finish with the call not to let this settle into a new normal. That's the main danger. Columbia's gates have been closed with locks since last April. And and to enter into campus now, everyone has to show ID. And we thought after summer that would end, and that hasn't ended. There's still locks. And it seems like there's no end in sight, right? Because the new interim president, who I don't know, I have nothing against, but she has mentioned how it's time to look inward and not outward. That let's not worry about how the community relates to Colombia. We have to first solve our own issues. And that's as an excuse to keep the doors locked. That is for me an invitation to think of this as the new normal, and we have to reject that invitation. We have to not allow this of becoming the new normal. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and hosting this crucial symposium. Really fantastic to follow on from Danny, because I'm going to be in large agreement, but not total. But yes, also speaking from the position of an anti-Zionist Jew who's been observing firsthand from the campus at the New School the ways in which we've seen unprecedented levels of repression, and alongside, I also need, for the very same reasons, to note I do not speak for the New School, but I also speak here as a journalist. I've been reporting on campus repression for The Intercept for the last year plus and onwards. And I do also want to preface what I'm about to say with, if we're talking about academic freedom at all, I don't think we can really start the conversation without noting that there is no university left standing in Gaza, and hasn't been for many, many months. And that is one of the ways where I feel like we cannot distinguish content and form of academic freedom. I don't believe it's an accident that this moment of repression, certainly cynically taken advantage of by Republican forces who care not a scratch for Jews, happened within what is widely known as the Palestinian exception. When Palestinian-American scholar Stephen Slater was famously fired for pro-Palestinian speech in 2014, he was a forerunner for this current repressive moment. He was let go from a tenured position at the University of Illinois. Following his firing, a public records request revealed communications between the university and several donors who had threatened to withdraw financial support unless Slater was fired. He was fired. The university then had to settle in a lawsuit with Slater. The settlement was $875,000. It's a lot, but his life was never the same again. In the last year, the only aspect of Slater's case that's rare now is this settlement. So there's no official tally of the number of academic workers who have lost jobs or faced suspension over support for Palestine, both on campus and in extramural speech, to echo Danny's concern about extramural speech being surveilled. But the reason there's no real tally here is because higher education in the US is disarticulated, often privatized, reliant on short-term contract labor. And by and large, professors facing job loss and suspensions have had to bring these allegations into public view by speaking out themselves. So we can't speak to how many scores of academics are facing these sort of investigations and stand to lose contracts quietly. They expire without renewal. So the political economy of the university very much serves the ability to remove troublesome staff. So I've written recently about a case that really follows on from Slater's in terms of landmarks, which was the firing of a also Jewish professor from Muhlenberg College, a small private college in Pennsylvania, for anti-Zionist speech, of course, and this was speech that never aimed at Jewish people as for being Jewish, and only decried the actions of Israel as an ethno-state. At my very own university, a university that has historically bartered in a reputation for social justice and indeed was founded on anti-war principles, I now have 3 colleagues, 2 professors and a staff member facing sanctions, including unpaid suspension for 3 months because they took part in a protest in March when a lieutenant, so officer class, from the Israeli military came to speak on campus. At this time, all Gaza's universities had been reduced to rubble, and the ICC and the ICJ were already investigating Israel for war crimes and genocide. But yet it is my colleagues who are facing suspension. In case after case I've reported on, and I really can't prove causality here, but the correlation is almost 100%. Severe sanctions have never only been a result of just a complaint from a community member about discrimination. In every case, there's also pressure, a pressure campaign of sorts from outside the school, typically in the form of donor pressure, always involving groups like Campus Reform, Canary Mission, ADL, APAC, and antisemitism.org, among others. Typically, we've seen automated emails in bot form, often in their thousands, being sent to administrations. This happened in the case of Muhlenberg. I'm moderating a talk on Friday with Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories at the New School. An automated email campaign organized by APAC generated 50,000 emails to my administrators this week. You know, these emails are also aimed at news outlets, politicians, demanding professors' outlets, and they are not, as they should be, readily ignored by institutions. A university economic structure that depends on the whims of wealthy donors or the decisions of parents who need to invest vast amounts of money in tuition, even in the cheapest occasions, it will leave itself open to this kind of outside interference. So this is a problem of the political economy of the university system in structure, which includes relying on contingent precarious labor, with right-wing attacks on tenure protections. Institutions are thus well positioned to eliminate political dissenters or those deemed so. Extremely convenient that it can be done in the name of protecting Jewish people. As mentioned, congressional hearings, we saw this play out. You know, the most prime example, I think, was former Columbia President Manoush Shafiq's abject performance in throwing her colleagues under the bus to appease Republicans like Representative Elisa Stefanik, who again couldn't care less about Jewish people, a famously anti-Semitic woman and obscene. So right-wing GOP, culture warriors, conservative Zionist groups, they're making use of this moment. Universities are bending to this, and it's with an unashamed willingness to take up the language of safety, which they had so lambasted in the past. It's a perfect political storm, driven in large part by sustained campaigning from pro-Israel groups. And it's produced a structure of feeling resistant to challenge. What are the elements there? Conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, increasingly put into de jure use with the kind of policy conduct changes that are put into place all too often by administrations without democratic input from university communities, and often with more input from outside groups like the ADL, like the Academic Action Network, that all have quite openly explicit pro-Israel positions. And again, as Danny mentioned, the equation of feeling unsafe with being unsafe, and universities not taking it upon themselves to do their jobs, which is demystification. As a Jewish professor who cares very much about my students' well-being, all of my students' well-being, I consider it to be an obligation to deal with addressing the difference between inculcated fear and actual threat. That doesn't mean I don't think speech can do harm and be a threat. I'm actually not a free speech absolutist in any way, but I think these interventions have to be based on material harm and systems of oppression rather than feelings of fear. We would not, for example, support a white student who had been brought up in a racist household, for example, who decided that the presence of a young black student in their presence was a threat, genuinely felt that. We would not validate that fear. We have lost a necessity of grounding, and we are working in a terrain of groundlessness and feeling that has left itself open to cynical attack. Some of this is also out of universities' hands if we're talking about outside pressure and autonomy. And that comes in the form of Title VI complaints through the Department of Education, federal complaints, in which universities must respond. It's a statute to respond if there is a federal complaint. And what we've seen this year is over 110 open Title VI investigations based on complaints since October 7th, 2023, which fall under the category of shared ancestry. So this is the category that covers anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hate. But most of these cases are relate to anti-Semitism claims. But here's the thing, to file a complaint, a person need have zero affiliation with the university involved or that community. Extraordinarily, 10%, if not more, of these current open claims have been filed by one man. His name is Zachary Marshall, and he's the editor of a right-wing website called Campus Reform. If you want to get a sense of his approach to these sort of claims of discrimination, if you look at posts on Campus Reform, a lot of them consist of very alarmed responses to Palestinian solidarity slogans or calls for ceasefire, vocal anti-Zionism from left-wing Jewish student groups. And this man is responsible for 10% of federal investigations that universities in turn respond to in panic, in fear. And even if the DOE doesn't find these complaints valid over time and in consideration when they make their considerations and conclusions, the investigations themselves provoke a chilling effect, as we've seen, as we've also seen with threats of litigation from these sorts of groups like the American Enterprise Network, sorry, I misspoke and misnamed it earlier, who play then an outsized role in rewriting conduct codes and codifying anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism without room for well-founded intellectual challenge. And these Title VI investigations drum up publicity, which can then put further funding at risk, or at least the fear of risk of losing further funding, which takes us back to questions of austerity and political economy that if they were structurally different, would be less vulnerable to these kind of attacks. And again, I would put forward, I would posit that we cannot separate this in the content of the Palestinian exception, and that, yes, calls for Palestinian liberation being permitted to stand as threats is an abrogation of educational duty. And the fact that we've seen in these Gaza solidarity encampments from UCLA, Columbia, the New School also, we've seen counter-protesters with pepper spray, noxious gases, in the case of UCLA, sticks, beating right-wing groups, beating people with sticks. And again, we've not seen an appropriate response from universities. At the same time, we talk rarely about the Palestinian students wearing keffiyeh who were shot last November. I haven't heard that spoken about for a very long time. That left one young man paralyzed for life. So I think, and this also is kind of in conversation with what Danny raised, so I'm excited to talk about this. We could be tempted to sort of hand it to the anti-woke right, because they warned about the proliferation of safe space therapy speak in our universities as organizing forces. But I think such criticisms rely on a bad faith framing of anti-racist work. And only the worst liberal iterations, in fact, play into that snowflake student feeling accusation. But it's a much more rigorous, difficult, contested at every turn exercise when students and professors proffer materially grounded, historically informed opposition to oppressive speech and discriminatory treatment on campus. So I don't think we need to leave it to a free-for-all in our defense of academic freedom under attack. So decisions around canceling speakers and banning certain speech, especially in universities that are not beholden to First Amendment protections to the same extent if they're private, like NYU. I think we should be able to have those ever contested discussions, but again, based in material recognition of oppression and violence. One final point I want to make, which also echoes Danny's, that if we're talking about safety and autonomy on campuses, since we're in New York, especially to invite NYPD officers to commandeer a campus because of an encampment or a protest, or even minor property damage of the sort we've seen, is to forego autonomy and safety entirely. I've written on political dissent and violent policing for 15 years, particularly in this city. Compared to when cops were called to clear CCNY and Columbia campuses, I've literally never witnessed such disproportion. I've seen worse violence, of course, but disproportion to the type of demonstration taking place, I've never seen. And I'll end with this visual for you that was deeply perturbing. So City College President Vince Bourdreau, don't know how it's pronounced, in his letter that invited the NYPD to storm his campus, made specific note that protesters had refused to take down a Palestinian flag from a flagpole. Police cleared the campus of all students who belong there and filled the space with cops instead. An NYPD deputy pulled down the Palestinian flag, raised the American one to its full mast, and riot cops, the only people on the campus, cheered below.
I want to just raise a question, or actually just kind of raise a thought about what we've discussed so far. And I guess I'm a little bit concerned because I think we have not delved into definitions of what academic freedom is. And maybe we're all sophisticated and we know what that means and we don't have to, but it seems to me I think we need to do that. Jeremy mentioned that in this moment, what we see is the right trying to assert ideological control over universities. And it seems to me we need to look at the content of that, and we need to be able to talk about our values. So, for instance, we argue, I want to see someone actually make the case that academic freedom is a pillar of democracy, not just assert it, but make the case. I also want to see them make the case about values, which is university and education is about the pursuit of knowledge and truth. Okay, if we start there, we can also then talk about what our values are, what our commitments are. We have a commitment to democracy. We have a commitment to justice for all. We have a commitment to engage all views while recognizing power differentials and historical context, right? Some groups are privileged, some are not. And I think that all has a lot to do. I think we need to spell out that stuff. And maybe because I'm a lawyer and I like definitions and I like things a little clearer, but it seems to me in this conversation needs some of that. So I just wanted to kind of put that on the table. And now I'll turn to this, to what I was asked to speak on. And so I kind of took a slightly different take. I thought, okay, what's the question here? If the question is, why is university autonomy important? Why is it significant? Then it seems to me that the current events in this kind of reactionary moment really provide the answer to that. So what we have seen, and here I want to really pull on a quote from PEN America, one of their reports that I think really sums up where we are and relates to my previous comments. They said, what's the underlying goal of the attack on higher ed, on education, et cetera? And they said the goal is to silence ideas and identities that some find uncomfortable, to control narratives about the past, and I think narratives more generally, and to ensure that only one set of values, viewpoints, and ideologies make it past the schoolhouse gate. So what are we seeing? So that's what we're seeing. We see in this moment the attempt to silence, censor, strangle, obliterate views and understandings that these folks do not like, even where those understandings could be classified as more true than anything else they have to offer. But the second point is, and the second activity by these kind of reactionaries, it's just what I'll call them, is that they really are trying to impose a single set of values, along with imposing distorted analyses and ideologies and outright disinformation. And so I want to assert that, and we can untangle that a little bit later. But let me kind of give you two examples that I think substantiate those. And one is one that we know, we've heard it forever, and that is the one about fossil fuels, Exxon, climate control, right? So Exxon and other fossil fuel companies set out to discredit environmental research on climate change. And they've cost us, and they've delayed any effort for us to make any progress on this problem for more than 30 years. They produced and promoted reports that suggested that climate change was a hoax, despite the fact that an overwhelming majority of scientists found that climate is changing, that the way we live is contributing to this change, and that we're in the middle of a major massive die-out of animal species. What were the scientists' goals? So their goals were to study the environment, to help us understand the environment in which we live. Sounds like a university mission, right? To not only have us understand the environment in which we live, but also the changes which are upon us, to educate us about where we are in the world in which we live in. This is, and contribute that information to us and to the world, right? To lift the knowledge of the world, about the world we live in. That's the goal. That's the goal of a university and of education, I think, more generally. And why did these kind of what I call planet killers not want this information researched, studied, and taught? Because it affected their bottom line. It affected their bottom line. It's profit over people and the planet. And we've seen this in other areas. I would say gun violence. So you may recall that there were limits placed on research about gun violence. Why, I suspect? I submit to you that it affected gun manufacturers' bottom line. So we've seen this kind of stuff where the idea is not just to silence certain kind of views, but also to impose these other kind of ideologies and ideas. The second example, which I won't go into much, I have much more written here, is to look at kind of a donor. And the donor I was thinking about was Mark Rowan. To kind of echo some of the conversations we've had earlier, Mark Rowan is a private equity billionaire. He co-founded Apollo Global Management, and he became the CEO in 2021. According to an American Prospect article in 2023, Apollo Global, as an equity firm, is an extraction machine, a firm in which 2/3 of a portfolio of companies have landed in distress or bankruptcy, but which have nonetheless enriched Apollo Global and its investors very well. Mark Rowan has a BA degree and an MBA from Wharton. He's not an educator, he's an investor. And so I focus on him because he started criticizing the president of the University of Pennsylvania and calling for her resignation and leading a campaign to hold donations to the university and to force her to resign prior to October 7th and the Hamas attack. And his complaint was that University of Pennsylvania hosted a Palestinian literary festival. His claim, the festival was anti-Semitic, although it's not clear there was any evidence of this. So why was he so concerned? Perhaps there were elements of anti-Semitism, even that he anticipated. Maybe they will manifest, maybe. But I suspect it's deeper than this, and it goes back to an earlier point. I think the idea is that he's a donor, not an educator. But the idea is to stifle any conversation about Palestinians, their cultural heritage, their history, and signs of their humanity, which might lead people in the U.S. to question Israeli governmental policy or U.S. policy to support the Israeli government no matter what. A policy that I believe that there's a great deal of consensus around in the United States. In other words, I submit that it's an attempt to control the narrative, ensure that it is examined, studied, analyzed, and taught from only one single perspective, when in fact there are not only two sides to that narrative, there are multiple narratives and perspectives. And a university is a place to explore all of that. And the effort is to kill that. But later, in addition, Rowan, apparently in his role as chair of the board of advisors at University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School, he sent a letter to UPenn's trustees suggesting that hard choices would need to be made, and those choices would potentially include issues related to closing departments, examining faculty hires, clarifying student speech rules, etc. But here, his email generated a harsh response. 900 University of Pennsylvania faculty members, among others, explained that these type of decisions were not within the purview of the trustees, but rather the product of shared governance practices among those with academic expertise. And so we need to tease that out. We need to talk about academic freedom. We need to talk about how it might be different from free speech. We need to parse all of that out. So these are two examples, and but what I'd like to make clear is that they're not really isolated events, but they are the work built over time of an extremely well-resourced and well-networked movement that has grown for decades. And we are outflanked financially. We're outflanked. And so why are universities the target? Because they are places where research is done and knowledge is produced and disseminated. And in order for them to control the narrative, whether it be about history or their thing of trickle-down economics, they need to control the narrative so that the policies that later get implemented are not necessarily for the common good, but for their own self-aggrandizement and wealth accumulation. And those are big pieces. So here, and where am I on time? I'm talking really fast. Am I talking too fast? Okay, I'll slow down. So now I want to turn to academic freedom, and I just want to say, and its actual supports. So academic freedom relates to goals of education, truth, basic information, understanding the world in which we live, who we are, how we came to be here, where it is, etc. But academic freedom in higher education has more structural protection, I think, than it does in K through 12, and we can talk about that. And it is protected in part by a labor regime, what appears to be more of a democratic labor regime, and supposedly shared governance. And so what's the labor regime? The labor regime has to do with tenure, requirement of due process before faculty members can be fired. So, you know, you go through a time, you get tenure, you have this kind of lifetime appointment unless you can dismiss for cause, and you have to have, and due process has to be in place. And this tenure and due process, et cetera, are often secured through union contracts, through labor contracts. And what they say is that tenured faculty get to think through controversial issues or not so controversial issues and do research and mount evidence and produce knowledge and disseminate it. Okay, so it's protected a lot of times through union stuff. This protection in some ways, I think, propels the mission of universities as institutions, right? It propels their mission to think about tough problems or not. But there's another piece, and that's shared governance. And shared governance, I think this idea that administrators and faculty share governance together, I'll say some more about that, also furthers this objective of institutional university autonomy of the institution, right? That shared governance, the sharing, helps to not only promote the mission, but helps to lead and give room for some autonomy for the institution. Several key problems. First, we operated in the context of neoliberalism, where we have, you know, this movement toward privatization. We have this movement to defund schools, but we also have this movement of corporatization of the university, which I think results in more top-down management, the codification, I'm sorry, I can't get that out today, academification of both research and education, among other things. And that's one side, that's a neoliberal side, and they bleed to each other. And then you have this kind of cultural backlash that doesn't just stay in the culture, but results in policies in law that ban entire academic frameworks like CRT and is exclusionary, grounded in a combination of a whole lot of isms. Then we have changed reality. This neoliberal moment and this cultural war have helped shape some of the other changes that we see. For instance, so we have this protection of tenured faculty. Tenured faculty in 1969, 1970 represented 90% of the faculty. Tenured faculty are now 30% of the faculty across the nation. Changes. And what does that mean for our idea of autonomy? And so the other thing that we see is we have a lot of contingent faculty who don't have the protection of tenure and are very vulnerable, can't exactly speak their minds on issues of concern. The second thing we've seen is the administrative ranks have grown tremendously, and we've seen them throw us under the bus. And then with shared governance, it was always more more theoretical than real, because ultimately, and the AAUP Irene, is in part responsible for that, because trustees, board of governors, and then presidents always had the final decision on a whole lot of issues. We weren't clear about that, but they had the final decisions. And the story is, in the past, there was a gentleman's agreement. I'm not so sure if I would consider them gentlemen, but there was a gentleman's agreement that politicians and donors would not interfere with the university. Well, that agreement is now gone, for sure. It no longer exists. Not even sure they're gentlemen, if there ever were, but that agreement doesn't exist. And here's where we're seeing some of the biggest threats to institutional autonomy. It is through intrusions, interference, and capture of board of governors, of boards of trustees, and then pressure on this administrative rank, including presidents that have grown. And so, okay, great. Okay, so that's diagnosing the problem. We can talk about the details. That's a real quick survey. A lot of claims there. Let me just end with what CLC. So the Critical Legal Collective is a group that was started about 2.5 years ago, right about the same time as Jeremy's project. At that point, we had seen the attacks on critical race theory. In fact, that's how we kind of came together. Critical race theory, we were really trying to supplement the efforts of the African American Policy Forum. And so we came together. We're mostly lawyers. We're in the legal academy. And so we bring a host of legal resources. The mission of the group is to build partnerships. And that's been coalitions. We've heard a lot of talk about that today. We can do more with that. To build partnerships, projects, and power to advance critical knowledge and action in pursuit of the promise of multiracial democracy with equal justice for all. Two arms, pedagogy and pedagogy and advocacy. What we have done, what we are focusing on in these partnerships is really unions. And so the AAUP and the CLC have done some work together. We are also focusing on HELO and trying to get at using collective bargaining, not just for wages, but for larger issues, and to get at some of these governance issues, including corporate control and corporate power through collective bargaining, through unions. And so our goal is to recruit academics into these different kinds of unions and try to push collective action through those. So that's one model. I think there are others around coalition and partnering. Thank you for your attention.
Perfect. Very good. Well, thanks, Carol, for inviting me, and I'm sorry for coming in so late and disrupting. Even though I'm actually, I think the most local. My office is literally on the same block, but I have a good excuse. For those of you who are not, I'm also like Athena, legal scholar, and this is the weekend of this is International Law Weekend in New York, and where the American branch of the International Law Association meets, and the International Law Association has been around since 1873. It's a long-standing institution. It meets in the fall in New York every year. This year, so there was a panel on Palestine, Israel, and international law. And surprise, surprise, that panel gets canceled. And they're told they're not diverse enough. This is a panel that had Palestinians, it had Israelis, it had people from India, Pakistan, England, and men and women. Yeah, and in an international law weekend conference tradition, which has been mostly white males. But anyway, this panel gets cancelled in the name of diversity. So it was going to be taking place 1 to 3. So in a sort of a last minute thing, we actually arranged for a room at NYU. It was taking place 1 to 3, so I had to help to sort of set it up and then ran here. So that's taking place right now, and it's recorded. So for those of you who want to hear what they said, and it has people who are talking in front of the International Court of Justice earlier this year. People you may have seen in the news, as well as lots of very well established and young legal scholars. It may be of interest. But anyway, I just want to mark that. But also to mark, it's a marker also of, just as again, another side note of the Legal Academy. Last week we had an event here on the right to food with the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur on the right to food, speaking about the right to food. But even that event, I'm part of the Guardian Human Rights Initiative. We had sponsors from other NYU institutions, Middle Eastern Studies, the Kevorkian Center, but we couldn't get a single co-sponsor from the law school. We didn't even need money. We just couldn't get their name on the poster because they were all so terrified. This is the UN Special Rapporteur. It's not, someone with a very radical profile. It's just speaking about famine in Gaza, but even that was seen as too threatening. And this includes, I should say, the law school institutions include human rights centers. NYU, of course, is known as a center for the study of human rights, but nevertheless, not one of them could stand behind or co-sponsor the special rapporteur on the right to food. Okay. So anyway, I joined the Critical Legal Collective partly because, as you can see, I knew Athena when I was like a baby in law school. And as you can see, she's a force of nature. And when Athena calls you and tells you to do something, you would just say yes. That's the only answer you can give. So I joined Critical Legal Collective maybe a couple of years ago. Yeah, 2 years ago. So yes, at the beginning. And then because of the attacks on critical race theory. But over the last year, much of my energies have been directed on the attacks against speech, calling attention to and condemning a genocidal war. Yet on many counts, I see these two battles as deeply interconnected in ways that speak to the importance of university independence and the reason why universities have been attacked so relentlessly. So I thought what I'll do in my remarks is speak about actually the ways in which these are intertwined struggles, the struggle around Palestine solidarity speech and speech defending critical race theory, in ways that go to our work, the university mission. So firstly, I think that Palestine solidarity speech and critical race theory speech have not only been expressions of dissent from hegemonic truths, but they are expressions of dissent that have spoken to the history of structural inequality. In the US case, critical race theories has spoken to the dispossession of Native people, the horrors of chattel slavery, and the afterlives of colonialism and slavery that are part of our present, including in America's most revered laws and institutions. In the Palestinian case, it is Palestine solidarity speech that has situated the current violence, as horrific as it is, in the history of the Nakba. It's not violence that came out of nowhere. They've situated the violence in the history of the Nakba, the history of Mandate Palestine, and the Balfour Declaration, in the circumstances surrounding the creation of the State of Israel. And sort of these links between speech and structural analysis that both of these traditions have advanced is, I think, quite critical and quite critical to the purpose of university life and the independence of university. We value and desire academic freedom and the independence and autonomy of our schools and universities because they are spaces where we can learn, discuss, and analyze these histories. And that is a precondition to informing and empowering struggles against those structural injustices and histories of racial and colonial oppression. As the Critical Legal Collective noted in our statement last year, we support academic freedom because it is a value we cherish and respect in its own right, but we also respect it because it is integral to the fight against racial injustice. So that seems a critical link. So a second link between academic freedom and the struggle against structural injustice, as one dimension of the connective tissue between Palestine solidarity speech and critical race theory speech, is that both these struggles expose the inadequacies of received approaches to liberal freedom. We have the empirical evidence of those limits in ways that many purportedly liberal institutions have performed the Palestine exception to their liberal commitments. So PEN America, which I know is a co-sponsor of this meeting, but PEN America, the ACLU, and of course our universities, Harvard, Columbia, NYU, these experiences have underscored that when we show up for academic freedom, we need to bring our distributive analysis with us. We need to analyze the political economy of speech, the structural context within which speech is located, free speech, diversity, safe spaces. These are not universal in their reach. It is always a speech of some and the discomfort of others. Some registers of diversity at the expense of others. The security of some against others, and the structural inequalities and hierarchies that cover all the other aspects of our life are also present in the arena of speech. So a focus on academic freedom has also got to be, therefore, an analysis of how those freedoms are distributed, whose voices are heard, and who's rendered more inaudible in sort of traditional free speech discourse. We need universities to be independent institutions that can operate with autonomy, but this commitment also has to be tied to an analysis of the biases and inequalities that are internal to our universities. A third dimension of the convergence in academic administration and suppression of critical race theory speech and Palestine freedom speech is a weaponization of the very institutions, policies, and approaches that emerged from the civil rights movement to police and suppress those speech. At NYU, as is true, I think, in many contexts and many universities all over the country, there's been a disproportionate number of students of color who have borne the brunt of disciplinary action from the anti-Palestine solidarity suppression. And of course, bringing in the NYPD has underscored the ways in which these vulnerabilities have compounded each other. And of course, they've used institutions like the Office of Equal Opportunity and used things that were in the books, supposedly to advance racial justice within the universities, but have been flipped. And of course, this is a familiar, the flipping of racist, of anti-racist institutions into racist institutions is a familiar story in the story of racial injustice since from the civil rights movement on, which critical race theory has been particularly important in sort of bringing to light. But it, of course, it is something that we have seen again and again over the last year. So a fourth dimension, I think, of this intertwining of these two struggles is that the policing of speech has been also intertwined with the policing of public space and other kinds of freedoms, including freedom of religion. In NYU used to have a byline, and maybe it still does in some of its sort of propaganda material, of a university without walls. That was NYU's claim to fame. But if you walk around NYU, you will see all the public spaces walled off. Right? There are chains over public benches. We are told in no uncertain space that outsiders control our space. We are the second-class citizens on our own campuses. It is our space that is precarious. We are barred from having any collective presence in Gold Plaza and Schwartz Plaza. A few days ago, anti-Zionist Jewish students constructed a Gaza solidarity sukkah on Schwartz Plaza, and NYU pushed them out. These students then went to Washington Square Park, only to be confronted with threats and bullying. Basically, anti-Zionist Jewish students have also found that they do not enjoy the protection of their practice of Judaism the way they define it within NYU. Right? These are all sort of deeply intertwined. And of course, bringing in the NYPD to police all of this has, of course, made black and brown bodies all the more vulnerable. And finally, the last thing I want to say about the convergence of these struggles and why universities are especially significant for these is that and that goes to the heart of the university, namely its students. What this last year has reminded us is that students whose political consciousness was shaped by Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock, they had, and that shaped their understanding of what is happening in Palestine, and also the political and intellectual stakes of how we discuss these events. These are intertwined struggles on campus and off, and across all our campuses, across both nationally and internationally. This I also want to close with a reminder in some sense that students are conscious, as we all should be in many ways, that this is happening, as one of my colleagues in this panel also mentioned, in the context of the scholasticide in Gaza, where universities and their colleagues, other students all over Gaza, are unable to pursue their education, and that underscores the context within which our universities are battling and the stakes of these struggles.
Thank you, Basuki. Thank you for your excellent excellent presentation. Was wonderful presentation. They gave us many very stimulating and fruitful approaches and ideas for our discussion and to keep our dialogue active, I think. Some of the topic our panelists discuss include the attack on university autonomy due the an instability and poor working condition and threats to teaching work. The attacks on public education and education as a public good from authoritarian or far right governments in the region in different countries. The threats to academic freedom and freedom of opinion, to the conflict in Gaza, Palestine, and Israel, and the contradiction and challenges that it generates, which include anti-Semitism and how to express solidarity with Palestine, the ways and paths in which academic freedom allow us to research independently and from critical perspective on sensitive issues of social importance, such as climate change and the carrying of carrying of guns, among others. And in the same sense, university autonomies guarantee the production and the dissemination of knowledge with freedom. The university autonomy is an important tool in the struggles against injustice and inequalities, against discrimination, and in favor of racial justice and more equal university, among other issues.